All right, thank you, everyone. After that great opening to this discussion, we're going to continue on with some perspectives from the energy industry on Mexico. My name is Garrett Golding. I'm an Assistant Vice President for Energy Programs here at the Dallas Fed. I'm not going to say a whole lot here, but I'll say the standard disclaimer that Jesse just presented, that my views are my own, not necessarily that of the Dallas Fed or the Federal Reserve System. So all that I say is just my opinion, but it should be yours too. So this panel, we're going to have it kicked off by Andrew Zoller from Energy Intelligence. EI is a leading energy research and media company with offices all over the globe. Key focus areas of energy intelligence research, where Andrew is a manager, include the low carbon transition, corporate strategy, and competitor intelligence, oil and gas LNG markets, and above ground risk. Andrew leads coverage of Latin America across all research areas and bespoke advisory engagements. And he'll probably be best positioned to answer the question from before on Eagle Ford production potential. Following Andrew will be Mark Rolls, Senior Vice President, Commercial and Refined Products at ONEOK. He is responsible for all commercial activities related to ONEOK's refined product and natural gas liquids regulated pipeline assets. Mark has a long career in the pipeline space, including roles at Magellan and Williams, and we're really excited to hear about ONEOK's business delivering energy south of the border. And now for something completely different, we have Alberto de la Pena, partner at the law firm Haynes & Boone. Alberto serves as a firm-wide chair in Mexico practice, chair of the Mexico Practice Group, and co-chair of the International Practice Group. He is licensed to practice law in Mexico, Texas, and New York, with more than 30 years experience in advising companies doing business in Mexico and Latin America. His practice focuses on complex international business transactions and projects for both private and public companies, as well as large compliance matters and investigations. So we're really glad to hear the legal world's perspective on doing business in Mexico, particularly when it comes to the energy industry. So with that, I'll hand it off to Andrew to get us started.
For starters, I apologize if you've seen some of this material already, but let's go through it very quickly. Mexico had upstream. Oh, there we go. Mexico's oil and gas production has suffered a long-term downward trend since the early 2000s. Liquids production went from about 3.8 million barrels a day to around 1.8, and as a result, you've seen a deterioration of oil balances, where they went from a major net exporter to breaking about even now. You've seen a similar production slide on the natural gas, where we've seen production go from slide from about 5 BCF per day to around, give or take, 3 or 4. And at the same time, though, we've seen a major increase in consumption. And as a result, it's become a major net importer. And now, as previously mentioned in the earlier panel, 75% of Mexico's demand is now met by imports, almost exclusively from the United States. At the same time, Pemex suffered, and despite numerous attempts to help the company, it became one of the most indebted, if not the most indebted company in the world, while production continued to slide. As a result, recent Mexican presidencies have vacillated wildly on policy in various attempts to try to mitigate the scenario. I was mentioned earlier, but in 2013, former President Enrique Peña Nieto launched a historic opening, and this attracted numerous foreign companies. This attracted and several bid rounds, both on and offshore, as well as in deep water, throughout multiple play types. And this attracted the who's who of industry players, super majors, NOCs, a large number of independents, both in the U.S. and Europe. And really kind of showed that there was the appetite, at least in the mid 2000s, for investment in Mexico. Critically, many of these same blocks are available today, are still in, are one of the main avenues where a lot of private investment is still present, and they are still moving forward. You still have companies like Eni and Repsol advancing projects. You have Woodside at the Trion fields. You have some movement on some of these legacy fields. However, when Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador came in 2018, he really closed the door on new openings. You really had a major rollback of a lot of the reforms. While these old contracts were still in place, it basically shut the door to new farm outs and new opportunities to really engage with Mexico. Sorry, yeah, that was a chart that showed just kind of how successful you had all these farm outs were and how successful the bid rounds and just the sheer volume of interest that many of these companies had. At the same time that Lopez Obrador attempted to roll back the reforms, he put the onus on Pemex, particularly on the oil side, to try to reverse the slide. And that's where you see you saw in the previous presentations that increase in Pemex capex was mostly focused upstream. The natural gas was relatively ignored, and the energy sovereignty angle and questions was mostly focused on trying to bolster Pemex production. However, it didn't really do much. They weren't able to move the needle. The company Pemex finances continued to remain really bad, and this was despite the fact that Pemex received an extraordinary amount of help from the Mexican government. Taxes were slashed considerably, bailouts of various financial incentives, and there was a concerted effort in Mexico City to try to bolster Pemex, but it just hasn't been able to move the needle. At the same time, the hydrocarbon dependence on the U.S. has continued to rise, particularly on the gas side, and it's really kind of running into tensions with the whole conversation of energy sovereignty when you're 75% dependent on a northern neighbor. Into these veins, we've seen energy policy beginning to shift once again. New President Claudia Sheinbaum has kind of cracked the door back open to private investment, relying on what she calls Pemex mixed contracts. So they're trying to launch a series of new contracts with Pemex where Pemex holds at least 40% of the stakes, and it varies, it can be higher than that. And these are going to form a considerable part of what they view as like the future investment in Mexico, somewhere between 15 to 20% of both investment and what they view as liquids and natural gas output are supposed to come through these forms of these mixed contracts. And critically, when you look at it, they're really not even trying to bolster production so much as stop the bleeding. They're aiming more for a plateauing of current levels. As part of this process, they identified numerous fields which could be put out as part of this mixed contract process, both onshore, shallow water, as well as some more complicated deep water plays. However, so far, they have not really seen that much success. What they've done, they've had success mostly on the smaller onshore plays, where they've had numerous farm out partnerships, but they've almost been exclusively with smaller Mexican players, countries like Carlos Slim's group or Consorcio Petróleo 5M del Golfo and other small players within Mexico. Probably not enough to substantially move the needle. That being said, there are speculation that they are talking to some foreign partners. There's been reports of super majors interested, but I think the most promising one is there's a conversation ongoing between Pemex and Petrobras about a potential offshore agreement and partnership, and this would make a lot of sense for both sides of both companies. There's a lot of political alignment between the Brazilian and Mexican governments. Additionally, Petrobras is a very skilled offshore deep water player, and so that can bring that kind of expertise to the Gulf and has more experience working with that sort of government. But also, at the same time, Petrobras is looking to expand outside of Brazil and beyond the pre-salt, both internally in areas like the Foz do Amazonas in Brazil, and also going further afield. So this sort of partnership does seem to be one of the most promising ones for what you could see if you start bringing in foreign companies. Another area that was brought up was the unconventionals. They're in the process of determining if they want to proceed, how they want to proceed, as was alluded to in the previous presentations. And this is another area where you could see private participation. You almost have to. Pemex doesn't have the capital or critically the expertise to try to advance this field. So if they were going to look forward to moving to advancing those, they'd almost have to rely on foreign partners. Given the proximity and the similar geology to like the Eagle Ford, you'd expect there'd be a large component of smaller U.S. company or U.S. companies involved. Other potential candidates are some Argentine independents that are a couple more present in Mexico and also have a presence in Argentine shale. But beyond that, there's just not a lot of players if you're really looking to advance shale capacity beyond those people that are present in Texas. And so if they're serious about this, that kind of has to be the angle, I think, whether you have to rely on. That being said, it is a very difficult political hurdles to overcome, local opposition. Historically, it is a big move. And so whether or not they actually achieve that is yet to be determined, but it is one other area to keep an eye on that you could see foreign participation. Another critical thing is that Mexico will have to compete against other investment destinations for capital. This doesn't happen just in a vacuum. Mexico will have to compete with Brazil, the Guyanas, increasingly Venezuela, even for areas where you try to get this foreign investment dollars. And so the fact that there's so many of these outstanding questions is a major concern. And at the same time, so they'll be trying to, so the upstream companies are going to be judging, Mexican space versus all these other potential investment destinations. Granted, it is a very promising time because there is going to be a lot of incentive for people to try to expand and diversify regionally in the wake of the war. But Mexico does have to compete with these companies, and there is a big trust deficit with a lot of the foreign partners, and things like the judicial reforms and just the major policy swings do bring a lot of questions about whether or not some of this is feasible, which is part of why you've probably seen some of those delays with or the tepid interest so far from a lot of these private companies. All in all, what it probably means is that you're going to still continue to see those reliance on imports, unless they don't open the door to more private participation. And with that, yeah.
And next we will have Mark Rolls from ONEOK.
Good morning. Hope y'all can hear me. I'm 6'6", so I'm a little bit further away from the microphone here. So again, my name is Mark Rolls. I'm Senior Vice President of Commercial for Refined Products and Natural Gas Liquids and Marketing at ONEOK. You're probably asking who ONEOK is. It's not necessarily a household name for many of you, but I will get into that here in a minute. Thank you to the Dallas Fed and SMU for coordinating this event, and for Jim coordinating this event and moderating it, Garrett, and we appreciate the invitation. Interesting topic today. It's front in mind, especially in today's world. When talking about U.S.-Mexico trade and Texas-Mexico trade, it's really easy to get into geopolitics and policy. I'm going to focus a little differently than some of the other speakers. I'm going to focus on midstream infrastructure and pipeline and marine facility infrastructure in the United States that feeds Mexico, and some of the challenges and some of the stats around that. So who is ONEOK? ONEOK is a leading U.S. energy infrastructure company based in Tulsa, Oklahoma. As you see by some of the stats, we operate about 60,000 miles of pipeline in the contiguous United States, hitting about 19 states. We effectively can move products from border to border, and it's all the products that we're talking about. It's crude oil, natural gas liquids, and it is refined products as well that I'll share with you here in a minute. I know there's a lot going on this slide, but essentially the purple lines on this slide are all pipelines that are natural gas liquids. The green lines are refined products, so delivering from refineries down to end markets all the way across and also down into the Gulf Coast and into Mexico. And then the light blue lines are natural gas pipelines, and then you'll see the diamond shapes and the massive amount of, you can't even tell on the map, but the massive amount of pipes in basins. Those are natural gas gathering and processing assets that we operate. To put some of these volumes into perspective, we're talking today about BCF and MMC and barrels, and for people that aren't in the industry, it's hard to comprehend what that really means. Well, just look at the refined products volume that we ship alone just on our company, a little over 1.5 million barrels per day. If you put that into perspective, and just to bring it to life for everyone, about 60% of that volume is gasoline that we ship through our systems. To put that in perspective, every single day you could fill up 2 to 3 million vehicles, and those same vehicles could travel about 1 billion miles per day by just the volumes that our company moves. So imagine the stats on that and the amount of volume. That's just one company that's making those moves. So it shows the vast resources that we have in North America, in this country, and then you'll hear in a minute about how that impacts Mexico as well. Our role, ONEOK's role is very straightforward. We connect the production, demand, safely, reliably, and economically. When we do our jobs, the energy markets flourish and create stability. So little bit about the midstream chain. So this is a simplified version. There's about 1 million things that go on in between here, but just to put this into perspective, the wellhead starts here. At the wellhead, it splits out crude oil and natural gas. I'll start in the top first. Natural gas is ran through, this is raw feed natural gas will run through natural gas processing plants. It's split to residue gas, which is used for industrial, electric generation, exports, et cetera, and LNG. And then raw feed NGLs, which are then transported, they're fracked into grades like ethane, propane, isobutane, normal butane, natural gasoline. And then on the bottom side, crude oil, very familiar probably to most of you, but it's shipped through pipelines to refining markets, refined into refined products, mainly for transportation use, gasoline, diesel fuel, jet fuel, et cetera. ONEOK, our company, kind of operates between the wellhead and delivering off to end markets. And so when you think about Mexico, the trade with the United States and Mexico when related to energy products, it's really on the natural gas side, as we've heard today, and on refined products that I'll hone in on here in a minute. So Texas, Mexico, combined the US, Mexico, and Canada account for about 37% of global GDP, illustrating North America's energy is global energy security, and we're seeing that firsthand today with everything going on internationally. Over the past decade, the United States and Mexico have established critical energy highway and global energy supply chain, and it's not just regional. Take natural gas, for example. This stat has been thrown out several times, but it's a very significant fact, and that's that 3/4 of Mexico's natural gas supply is supplied by the United States, and that's mainly through pipelines, almost all through pipelines, which are obviously critical infrastructure. And what we've talked about earlier, I know Jesse mentioned it, but the importance of pipelines in delivery of natural gas and refined products to Mexico are a very critical component. Similarly, more than 70% of the gasoline and diesel fuel consumed in Mexico is delivered by the United States. We hadn't talked about that yet, but that's about 1 million barrels a day. That's critical for price stability, for transportation, vehicles, trains, trucks, airplanes, et cetera, very critical. And the main reason for that is because the United States is relatively balanced on the refining and demand side for refined products, but there are about 2 million barrels a day of gasoline and diesel fuel that's exported out of the United States, mainly out of PADD 3 in the Gulf Coast. About half of that goes into Mexico. Mexico has a pretty vast refining network, but compared to the United States, they operate at about 50 to 60% utilization historically. And so there's a short of refined product supply in Mexico. There's length in the United States, and that's mainly supplied via ship and pipeline through our systems. So conversely, let me go back one. Conversely, United States does import some crude oil from Mexico. It's not significant. Let me go back one. There we go. It's not significant. It's about 300,000 barrels a day. And the dynamics in the United States refining network, we hear about being energy, having the crude oil that we want to process here. And the United States refining network is set up to where historically, especially in the Gulf Coast and the Mid-Continent region, those refineries are set up to handle heavy crude. So when the shale revolution occurred, it started to produce lighter crudes. The United States still imports about 4 million barrels a day from Canada, heavy sour crude that those refining networks are designed to process. And now with production mainly in Texas, you're seeing exports of around 4 million barrels a day of crude out of the Gulf Coast. In fact, just in April, that hit a record of 6 million barrels a day of crude oil exported out of the Gulf Coast United States. So obviously driven by geopolitical events and demand on the other end. These data points paint a clear picture. Cross-border energy trade operates as a sustained system-based relationship supported by vast U.S. And North America natural resources, infrastructure, and then demand as well. So reliable energy requires long-term investment. We've talked about that on the LNG front today, 4 or 5 years of development time for these assets. It's no different than pipelines. When we build pipelines in the United States, even in politically friendly areas, it's 1 to 2 years of permitting time and another 18 months to 2 years of construction. So you're 3 or 4 years in of capital investment before you ever start to see any returns on those investments. And we're talking about massive capital investments. Historically, there was a rule of thumb when you built pipelines in the United States, it was $1 million a mile. Well, we build pipelines now in areas where it's $10, $15 million a mile. So it's that cost and running those pipelines creates it's a significant investment for us. But reliable trade requires long-term investment. ONEOK has seen firsthand how complex cross-border coordination can be. We operate a pipeline called Roadrunner. It runs from the Permian Basin to the border just south of El Paso, Texas, and it crosses the border there and connects into third-party pipelines in Mexico. And that's a natural gas pipeline. It's a 30-inch diameter pipeline. We built that about 10 years ago, and navigating the permitting complexities of crossing a border, and then of course getting long-term commitments from customers was very significant, and collaborating over years-long processes to get those kind of projects done. So that asset now results in about 570 million cubic feet per day of natural gas deliveries into Mexico just through our pipeline from the Permian Basin. A major asset for us. But what Roadrunner demonstrates is that reliable investment isn't speculative. It's grounded in capital, commercial, and operational discipline. And we need the political fronts on both sides to be supportive of these type of projects to advance them. So the economics of energy movement. This is no surprise coming from a pipeline company, but the data is truth. That's right. Jesse pointed that out just now. Pipelines do continue to outperform all other modes of transportation, both on cost, reliability, safety, and scalability. And the impact is significant. Just the Texas-Mexico energy trade is worth about $50 or $60 billion per year, as we've seen earlier. And obviously, both countries are reliant on each other and need to be, as well as the United States' reliance on Canada for heavy sour crude, as I mentioned earlier. Nearly 100% of the natural gas is exported via pipelines into Mexico from the United States. A significant portion of refined products, diesel fuel, gasoline, and jet fuel are delivered by pipelines, but actually the vast majority is delivered by ships. Our company operates multiple marine facilities in the U.S. Gulf Coast that load ships and moves to ports like Tuxpan, Veracruz, and Altamira. And as we've talked about earlier, infrastructure in Mexico has also been a challenge, especially on the refined product side with pipe tapping, things like that. We don't actually operate any pipelines in Mexico today, but that's always been a strong concern of operating pipelines, just the security around running those pipelines. But we are always looking for new opportunities, and obviously with all the data you've seen today, we'll have plenty of natural gas in this country, plenty of crude oil, and not enough demand likely in the United States to consume all that, and a large demand in Mexico, which is going to be important. So just a future look, LNG export capacity, as we've talked about earlier, is projected to double over the next decade. Data centers, we talked about that a little bit earlier, but will likely add approximately 8 BCF per day of natural gas demand in the US and possibly incremental in Mexico. And a large portion of US natural gas production, we hadn't talked about this yet, but also has recoverable natural gas liquids tied to that. ONEOK is currently building a LPG export dock down in Texas City that will export propane and butane. That's all underway. And then, as I mentioned earlier, crude oil exports. Just 10 years ago, there were 0 crude oil exports coming out of the United States, and just last month there were 6 million barrels per day. Pretty remarkable. So with that, that's all I had, and thank you for your time.
And Alberto de la Peña from Haynes and Moon.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. My name is Alberto de la Peña. I'm from Haynes and Moon. And, I must confess that before the presentation, I was considering whether I should do slides or not, and then with graphics and numbers. And then I thought, maybe my economists and business friends will have much better slides. And then I was not mistaken. So there are no slides for me. Thank you to the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas, the SMU, Mission Foods, Texas Mexico Center. So I will give a talk a little bit different about the energy market in Mexico, more from the legal perspective. And Mexico is facing one of the biggest energy challenges I think it has had for years, because you have a growing industry, particularly on the manufacturing sector, not only because of the nearshoring, but because of all the activity across the border. And that growth has outpaced the energy supply infrastructure. And you can see it both on the oil and gas side and on the power sector. So on the oil and gas, Mexico has the lowest oil production it has had in 4 decades. And you see, as you have heard in this and the prior panel, Mexico imports most of its natural gas from the United States. It's also a net importer of gasoline. And the financial situation of Pemex, which controls the market, is critical. Depending how you measure, but there is like $100 billion in debt, $24 billion owed to suppliers. So it is a tough spot. On the other hand, CFE, which is a government-owned company on the power side, even though has better numbers than Pemex, it still has a large debt of 25 billion. And on the power side, most of our conventional power obviously most of our power is conventional. Only 24% is clean energy. And that conventional power is that electricity generated by natural gas, combined cycles, and we even have some coal plants. So the conclusion of this is, and I think this is reinforced by the prior panels, is we need capital investment in Mexico and technology to develop the industry. We have other challenges such as security, infrastructure in other areas, water supply that was mentioned, as well as the rule of law, and obviously a new geopolitical environment, right, that we are living in. So talking about the legal framework, the first thing that we need to understand is under Mexican law, all the natural resources on the ground are owned by the state. That's a big difference from here, right? What we call here the mineral rights are owned by the states. We don't have under Mexican law the difference between surface rights and mineral rights. You own the surface, but all the minerals underneath, on the subsoil, are owned by the states. And if you look back as to, I think to understand the current regulation and where we are, we need to see how we evolve from here. And we have 3 stages, I will say, on the regulatory side in Mexico in the energy market. So the first one was a state monopoly. The second one was the open market. And the current one is what I would call the state-led market. So on the monopoly era, which started with the current Mexican Constitution of 1917, and it goes all the way to 2013, which was basically, except certain areas that we will talk, it was a state monopoly. We have the expropriation of oil companies in 1938. That's when Pemex was created as a monopoly in oil and gas. The year before, 1937, CFE was created to produce power, but it was not a monopoly until 1960. So since 1960, it's a monopoly. And even when NAFTA was negotiated in 1994, the energy sector was excluded from the negotiations. The only 2 exceptions during this period from 17 to 2013 was in 1992, there was a limited opening in power where private companies could produce power to sell to CFE, also to export, and finally for self-consumption. Those were the three exceptions that private investment was allowed. Also in 1995, there was private investment allowed in the pipeline transportation, distribution, and storage of natural gas. So, but other than that, everything was run by the state. Then we come to 2013, and the market, something happened that in Mexico, as Adrian said, you know, the oil and gas sector and the energy sector is a very political sensitive issue. Something happened that no one thought that it would happen, that is the market was open. And at that point, Pemex and CFE became one more player, right? Under the new rules, there were new regulators that were independent, that were created to regulate the market, including Pemex and CFE. And some of the old regulators that existed at the time were revamped with new authorities, such as the Regulatory Energy Commission and the Hydrocarbons Energy Commission. They existed before, but really didn't have a lot of authority. So in this open market that goes from 2013 to 2018, you know, there was a booming investment in the energy sector, and a lot of private companies, including obviously big companies, oil companies from the States, went to Mexico. Before 2013, all gas stations in Mexico were Pemex stations. Now you have you know, all brands in Mexico. Then we get to 2018. And in 2018, I think there was a big shift that was consolidated in 2024 and then 2025, where some additional constitutional reforms and legal reforms. But basically what happened is, it's still an open market, but between 2018 and 2024, the opening of the market has slowed down. On the upstream side, there were no more bids for private companies to do exploration and production. Everything was handled by Pemex. A lot of the permitting is slowed down, particularly for private companies. So there was a little bit of a slowdown. Public funding went to refining operations. They started building the Dos Bocas refinery, also investment in Deer Park here. But there really was not major public funding for clean energy in Mexico during this period. Also, the regulatory agencies that were created, these independent regulators during the open market, disappeared and were replaced by the National Energy Commission, which has a general director that is appointed by the president and ratified by the Senate. So what's the current, so that's kind of the background. So what's the current regulation? So let's talk first about oil and gas. So on the oil and gas, on the upstream side, exploration and production, everything is pretty much reserved to Pemex. So Pemex, you know, has the right to do all the exploration and production, and only if there is a field that they don't want to develop, then the state could, by exception, contract that with a private company. Now, Pemex can partner, right, with private entities to do the exploration and production, but there are certain rules. And just in the macro of these rules, they can do what is called mixed contracts that you may have heard, where Pemex can partner with private investors. In those contracts, Pemex must have at least 40% of the participating interest without a capital commitment. And there are also some strict rules about cost recovery between 30 and 40% per year. So in this framework, Pemex, you know, will control the activities on the upstream side. On the midstream and downstream, it is technically an open market. It is technically, you know, open to permitting, but you have a big influence of, obviously, of Pemex, because really the open market just lasted from 2013 to 2018, so in full. So Pemex, obviously, as a monopoly for more than 70 years, you know, had a lot of influence. Right now, 84% of the gasoline supply is controlled by Pemex. So there is there are opportunities, but there is a big presence of Pemex. On the power side, there is something similar with CFE. CFE, there is a principle that no private firm can prevail over CFE. And what this means is that 54% of the annual average electricity injected into the grid must come from CFE. So CFE must provide 54% of the electricity to the grid. And also when in projects where CFE partners with private companies, they must hold at least 54% of the participating interest. So these both I think that that's what I will call this kind of my invention, state-led market, right? Because it's an open market, but do you have Pemex and CFE with a big presence? Two final thoughts. The first one is, we have this Mexico challenge of investment and technology we have discussed. There have been some incentives, Adrian mentioned the Plan Mexico, which is providing investments for infrastructure. This week, I think Tuesday, the Mexican president said that there will be major investments in clean energy. And as part of this plan, they tried to promote investment very quickly. Also, there will be a permit simplification, more transparent tax oversight, and simplify import process. I think the question that remains is, as with the information that we have, it doesn't look that this plan will provide a lot of incentives, but it still doesn't change this legal framework that I just discussed. And the question is if the legal framework will be enough to attract that investment. And I don't think anyone has an answer on that yet. The second thought is, we discussed the question about North America integration and whether, we should talk about North America energy independence or country independence, right? And there is this tension between the country and the region. The fact is, and I think we already know this by now, is that there is a lot of integration, right? You have heavy oil, crude oil from Mexico and Canada being refined in the Gulf Coast in US refineries, with the end product being shipped back, export to Mexico and Canada. You have all these cross-border pipelines between US and Canada, US and Mexico, electricity corridors between US and Canada. So the question is, I think that integration has already happened. And the question is how it should be deepened. And there is a quote from Ayn Rand that I like. She was a Russian-American writer that said, you can ignore reality, but you cannot ignore the consequences of ignoring reality. So with that, I will leave this for the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And I'm going to pick up on that, those final thoughts with a couple of questions to lead us off. And if you have questions in the audience, same drill as before, microphones on the side that you all can line up for, and we'll get to you in a moment. But to drill down, see what I did there on this energy independence discussion, it really is a not just an integrated, but a codependent, Canada, Mexico, US energy market. And I've spent my career in Planet Washington. I've spent it in Planet Industry and Planet Markets, and I sense like not a whole lot of broader realization in Planet policy, Planet Washington, on what we're talking about here. That this independence and integration piece are really the same thing. That this insulation that we get, through these relationships are incredibly important. When you all have dealt with policymakers and even the broader public in this concept of energy independence, I mean, what all do we need to do to, what are your recommendations on trying to get this type of discussion, elevated and more informed on just what the relationships here are and how important they are? And any one of y'all can start with that.
Yeah, I can start. Well, over the last few years in the United States, there's been a stark shift in energy infrastructure support, especially in non-renewable fuels. But even in the last administration, I think there was an understanding of the importance of energy infrastructure and pipelines and supporting production and across borders. The Keystone XL project coming out of Canada was canceled at the last administration. That's being rethought now. Those, I think, and that's not a political comment, it's just reality, similar to your comment you just made. It is reality, but we have to, everyone in Washington and in the states has to come to grips with that reality that the infrastructure in this country, whether it be renewable fuels, electricity generation, crude oil production, natural gas production, and getting those projects to demand centers like Mexico are of great importance. And as I mentioned earlier, the time it takes to develop these projects and actually get them into service is years. And so you have to be way ahead of the curve. Jesse talked about the Waha spread in West Texas as an example. Those projects that are coming online later this year have been in development for several years and in construction for a year and a half. Those are coming on as gas production continues to grow in the Permian Basin, which is expected to with the GOR. More projects are going to be needed. So there's a reality that we have to face, and we are not only dependent on the resources in this country and in North America. It is critical for security. It is critical not only for North America now and Mexico, it's critical for the world with everything going on geopolitically. We have to come to grips with LNG worldwide and what's happening in Europe and Russia, Ukraine. 15% of energy is offline right now with the Strait of Hormuz. And what's happened are people are starting to look for alternatives for long-term deals. And those are just starting right now. And when stuff like this happens globally, everything comes back to reality and people start looking around for new sources. And we are sitting on vast resources in North America that can help supply that demand. I'll stop there.
I agree with what Mark said. I mean, another thing I think to keep in mind is that how U.S. trade policy can also spook our partners too. That general interdependence was widely accepted. I mean, one thing that kind of struck me, even under the AMLO era, was that he was so nationalistic about oil, but he didn't care as much on the gas side, in part because there was this view that there was readily accessible, permanently cheap gas out of the U.S. But when you have very unstable trading partners and questions about USMCA long-term and things like that, it really kind of creates, both in Canada, where they're like, do we really want to be 85% dependent on US exports? And so it has to be at the same time, I think, keep in mind that, the benefits and that it can spook our partners on the trade side and the importance of stability in policymaking. The other thing I think also to flag up is that there's a misunderstanding, and I think the point about the heavy refineries is excellent. There's among the broader public, there's just not an understanding of some of the nuances that the oil we produce doesn't really fit with the oil we need, and you make more money selling it anyway. So there's really this so they still think that there's this element of protectionism and things like that could, that it's an issue. And I think that spills over into some of the export restriction conversations as well. And finally, I think one thing that struck me from one of the previous presentations was we showed the benefits of cheap power. I don't think we really talk just about how cheaper our energy is compared to the world, and that doesn't play up on just like gasoline prices, which people see every day, but natural gas, electricity, et cetera. We are in an incredibly advantaged position from an industrial perspective because of that cheap power, and kind of continuing to emphasize that how much that benefits everybody is another thing I think that would behoove people.
I will just add to whatever. I'm not a politician or economist, and I don't pretend to be. I understand why policies, for example, what's happening between the Mexico and U.S. relationship, why Mexico wants to be being so dependent on these outputs, right, from natural gas and gasoline, why they want to become more independent. But I think there's a question of efficiency. And a question of, if Mexico start developing now non-conventional natural gas, how long it's going to take, how much investment when it's so cheap here, right? And one thing that at least I believe on the perspective of Mexico that we don't have is time, because the industry keeps growing, and these investments, as you said, take time. And so we need that to start right away.
Thanks for that. And, Andrew, you talked about the nuances of all this there's a saying that I use a lot, that if you're explaining, you're losing. And this is one of those things, like, it is very easy to get lost in the details of this. And it just it takes too long to explain the nuances here for us to get, I think, a whole lot of traction on these points. So we can start with audience questions over here on the right.
Okay. I'm Hiroshi Takeuchi at SMU. My question is, thank you for a big picture of the current state of energy trade between US and Mexico. My question is, what's the perspective of the future direction? And what kind of development will have a most positive impact on the Mexican economy? So particularly, it seems that if you simplify the picture, Mexico is exporting crude oil to the United States, and then refined oil products like diesel and jet fuel, etc., is imported to Mexico. So would it be changed in the near future? And then what is the kind of best scenario for a kind of a win-win scenario for both Mexico and the US?
I can comment a little bit on the refined product state in Mexico. As I mentioned in my remarks, the refining capacity in Mexico operates at lower utilization than most refineries. And I think when Mexico opened up its borders for U.S. companies to import refined products into Mexico, they issued 5 permits to major refiners in the United States, and that's proven to be successful. And those companies have made significant investments in Mexico, and the ultimate winners in that are the consumers. Consumers, when they see when you have competition and you have multiple suppliers, that translates into positive things for the Mexican economy. But I do think that there's a strong push within Pemex in Mexico to strengthen their refinery footprint and strengthen their utilization. That would support utilizing, mine crude produced in Mexico, processed in Mexico, and consumed in Mexico, similar to what happens in the United States today. But for some reason that has not transpired. They recently put into service the Dos Bocas refinery. It's still not operating at about half utilization. So I think an area for Mexico that is being focused on is that refinery utilization, and they have refineries in critical spots in Mexico that have their baseline capacity, if utilized at rates of like 90%, would support significant demand in Mexico. But the reality is today that has to come from the United States. It's the most economical solution. As I mentioned, the United States refining capacity, all of the length is in PADD 3 in the U.S. Gulf Coast, which, from a proximity perspective, is easy to export into Mexico. So I'll stop there.
One other thing that supports that cross-border trade is Pemex also owns a refinery in Texas, Deer Park, and so there's some internal sales and shift back and forth as well that kind of keep a lot of that trade going as well.
James, or
Mark, I had this question for you. It seems like companies like yours, pipeline companies, are in really the driver's seat, because without you guys, it's like veins and arteries in the body. The blood doesn't get to the heart or the lungs. But at the end of the day, from an economic perspective, the cost component of what you guys represent in that final number going to the customers and users, what does that represent? And then I'm assuming you price based on cubic meters or something of that nature. kind of being the gatekeeper, so.
Yeah, to your point, so let me give you an example. So the economics of once a pipeline's in service, I'll use refined products as an example. In the United States, if you have a 100-mile pipeline and you're shipping through that, the actual cost of running that pipeline is probably somewhere around 1 to 2 cents per gallon to operate that pipeline. Tariffs typically run in the 5 to 6 cents on average range. So that's ultimately what the pipeline piece, that midstream piece of the supply chain is responsible for at the pump. But when you compare that to trucking, trucks take it the last mile, but if you utilize that same truck for that same length of distance, it's about 25 cents per gallon on average. So that shows and of course, then you have other complexities that come into that, like congestion in major cities, things like that. But when you're building pipelines, think about the economic lifetime of a pipeline. You start investing, buying the steel immediately when you FID a project. And by the time you actually start receiving returns or any cash flow on that investment can be 2-3 years down the road. And these are heavily invested assets, in some cases in the billions of dollars. And what we do is we look for customers that are willing to make long-term commitments on those. In most cases, you're not getting your capital back until somewhere between 5 and 10 years, and you're not actually getting your return for 15 to 20 years. So these are major investments that take time to develop. That's why that permitting timeline is so critical up front. If you can condense that, you're going to start getting your capital back earlier in that process. And then we always have to battle with, well, if someone's making a 10-year commitment and we're assuming a terminal value on the end of our economics, and there's risk out there that we don't get that, we have to take all that into consideration. So you're making judgments 10, 15 years down the road when you're making these investments. And then you add that to crossing a border where you're concerned about the politics on both sides and et cetera. So those are the kind of things we think about when we FID projects. And obviously with all that in the mix, it's important to understand that whole period of time. So hopefully that answers your question.
Go to this side, James.
Yeah, I have a sort of general question that you might want to save it for the last, but for each of your areas of expertise, if there was 1 or 2 things that you could change, if you had the magic wand to do that, what would it be in the legal area, the midstream area, exploration and production? And nobody so far during this meeting has said anything about Venezuela. I'm just curious if that's going to change the dynamic, what's happened in Venezuela. I'll leave it at that.
I can take that latter part. Yeah, Mexico has to compete with capital, and even with the increased interest in regional diversification, as I was flagging up earlier, Venezuela is going to be a big one where people are starting to look at again. You've got a lot of readily accessible resources. The new government or the new legislature has passed reforms that are much more friendly to industry, and so that's definitely where you're going to see a lot of people, or some people, starting to look at more. And so Mexico has to keep up with that as well. And that's on top of the fact that you've also got more traditional investment destinations. Guyana, Suriname, Brazil is a huge one that people are also going to look at, and as well as emergent areas in West Africa as well, so like Namibia. So you really are. It is a good question. I mean, Venezuela is that one that is going to be the new one that could take a lot of that capital. So it really kind of adds more pressure to try to compete.
Yeah, I can add one more thing on Venezuela. There will be investment in Venezuela. There's no question about it. And if you look at the infrastructure there, though, it has been neglected for many, many years. And it will take significant investment, and it'll take, the companies that are in there, like Chevron, are in there, and they have To draw more investment into a country like that, there's got to be security and stability, over the long term. Because as I just mentioned through the pipeline, think about when you're going out and you're doing production type stuff, equal time, if not longer. So you're making long-term investments. But Venezuelan crude is essentially very similar to Canadian crude. So in the United States, it's extremely important with our refining network in the U.S. Gulf Coast that processes heavy sour crude. So over time, I would see that being a pretty critical production area.
I will say on the Mexico side, investment doesn't like uncertainty, right? And we want to have more uniform, long-term policies on one hand, and on the other hand, I think a little more flexible policy. And again, we understand, where these policies are coming from, particularly in the new geopolitical environment. But going also to the question that was made before about what do you think is going to be the end game in Mexico? I think there will continue to be more investment to improve the private participation in Mexico. But this interchange will continue just because it is efficient and it works.
Just one other thing to add on Venezuela that I think is kind of underappreciated. Another area we could see the Venezuelan opening play out is in the LNG space, in Trinidad in particular. One area where there is a lot of probably more easily and readily developed, I think there's a lot of offshore gas fields that straddle the border or very near the border, and they've been held up for quite some time. And that might be one area where you see movement first, but that would add a new element on your Atlantic Basin LNG competition for like Texas.
Do you want us to answer the one change now? It's similar to what Alberto just said for me, but for our business and really for the energy space, political stability and regulatory stability around our space is really, really important. And I talked about the long-term investments. The seesaw of dynamics that go on just puts those questions that you mentioned, puts those questions in the back of your mind. Do we need to make this investment when we're expecting a return over 15 years? That's a big one. And you could go through multiple cycles during that period of time. That has to be supportive.
The other thing is the trust deficit. I think they're kind of on the same vein with stability. And also it is very difficult. People working with Pemex. Pemex's functional capacity is really strained at the moment. And that is something that kind of also just can dissuade partners. Particularly in some of those like more frontier areas like deep water or areas where they are not as experienced.
I would just add one quick thing, and that Mark already mentioned, but before is consumers. Many times policymakers think about many things, but not the consumers. And when you have an efficient market like this, even though it's regional, it benefits the consumers.
Yeah, I want to bring that one to life in this country right now that's playing out, and that is the West Coast of the United States. When you shut down refineries and you remove production and demand is very strong, it increases price, period.
Counter to my best judgment, I'll call on Jesse next to ask a question.
All right. This question is really more for Mark, but happy for everybody to chime in with related answers if you have anything. Building a lot of pipelines, building a lot of LNG, a lot of LPG export capacity, terminal upgrades and expansions for containers and barges and everything else, semiconductors, petrochemical plants, AI data centers. We're building a lot of stuff. Could you comment about the state of the labor pool, which in your industry, very skilled labor pool that is required to construct all of this stuff, and where do you think that outlook is in terms of both, like, there's a question, how much are we basically at capacity, or is this a constraint, and how are we dealing with this?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. I'll answer it like this. My son just graduated from high school. and he's going to be an electrician because he decided, am I going to go spend 4 years at a university and spend however much money, or am I going to go get a certificate and go right to work? And he went right to work. And it's for this very reason. I've been giving him some good counsel, I think. And there is a absolute, and when you think about data centers specifically, there's an absolute shortage of the trades. And we have to come to grips with that in this country, if not abroad as well. And I think when you think of pipeline construction, things like that, that's pretty good overall, but it is short. We see that in our cost come through. Contractors just continue to have to increase wages to support those types of projects. So absolutely, that is a big constraint. I think specifically though in the trades, especially the electrical trade, that is a very, very significant issue. And we think we're going to build all these data centers in this country and they're going to be maintained over years and years. That takes skilled people to go in there and do that. That is a big problem.
To your point about capacity too, I thought one of your graphs in your previous presentation was interesting. You showed power and it did kind of kick up there at the end where you had power previously. And that's kind of where you're starting to think that capacity is starting to come in as a constraint. And that also goes to the previous conversation. People are going to blame that on like natural gas prices, which are negative, while it's really that you can't build enough gas turbines. You can't bring people online to the grid fast enough. You can't, and so you already kind of are starting to hit, at least on the power side, some of those constraints already.
And one more question over here on the left.
Yes, my question is for Mark. And when you do these pipelines, because you be going across geographical areas and boundaries, how do you buy the easements? Since you're a publicly traded company, do you have right of eminent domain and condemnation? And have you run into situations where you have to reroute your pipeline because a particular community don't want it to come through? And then for the man from Mexico, Pemex is not, state-owned. What would it take for them to free some dead assets, i.e. can they privatize a percentage of the 100% in order to have Mexicans buy shares and then, raise capital instead of them going all over the world looking for money? Because being a state-owned oil company, if they free 40%, what do you think, for instance, if they free 40% ownership in Pemex, would that amount to billions of dollars? Can that be listed on the Mexican Stock Exchange so that people can buy it and then free money for them to do whatever they want to do?
I'll start with that first question. Yes, so that is an ongoing challenge for every company that builds pipelines. It doesn't matter really where you're at this point in the world. You have to go through that process, and the perspective that we take at ONEOK is this. We go out and we have public relations people, we have people that focus on indigenous lands, et cetera. And we go out and we develop those relationships way before we're ever planning to build any kind of pipeline through those corridors. And what we try to do is go through the least impacted areas. If necessary, we will reroute around certain areas. Using Texas as an example, the aquifer that goes through Austin, that area, if you look at all the pipelines, there's some historical pipelines that go through, but not anymore. They're routed all the way around the aquifer. We deal with that everywhere, every state we operate in. It's a challenge. However, we've always felt that instead of using force and using eminent domain, we try to go in and do it the right way. We try to go in, we pay market rates for the easements. We keep it up really well. We maintain our pipelines really well. And we treat those people fairly, and we try to, again, do it in the least impactful way that we possibly can. To achieve eminent domain, you have to be a common carrier pipeline. So we go through all those rules and laws. And in the end of the day, it is challenging and it takes time. But again, being ahead of the curve, developing good relationships, paying people what they need to be paid for those easements, taking care of the right of way is really, really important, and maintaining those assets are really important.
So every time an investor goes outside of the States, to invest, there is a country risk, right? And you assess that depending on the country. That's what I always tell my clients. I think in the case of Mexico, there is no reason to believe or any fear that there will be any type of expropriation or anything like that. I think the government has been clear on that in the sense that, you know, we have this open market that is going to be led by the state government-owned companies, but I don't think there is, no one has even mentioned or imply anything like that. So I don't think that's a real risk. And if you consider the interchange and commerce between Mexico and the US and how much we depend from all these resources from the States, I don't think that's a real possibility. Obviously, anything could happen. Any country could expropriate, right? But I don't think it's something that is there.
We are right on time. We're going to break to pick up lunches out where you picked up breakfast. And you know, please socialize, please eat. And in 30 minutes, we will start with our keynote from Clay Siegel from CSIS. So thank you to our panelists.